In the winter of 1875, in a small Kentucky town whose name has long since faded from most maps, there existed a silence deeper than snow. It was the kind of silence that settles into wooden homes after a death, when the clocks seem to tick more slowly, and every footstep on the floorboards sounds like an intrusion upon grief. Families in those days knew death intimately. It came for infants in their cradles, for mothers in childbed, for the elderly in their sleep, and sometimes, with particular cruelty, for children who had barely learned to write their own names. The Victorians, as we have come to call them, responded to this constant companion with ritual. They washed their dead with rosewater and camphor. They dressed them in white gowns or Sunday best. They opened the parlor curtains just enough to let in the gray winter light, and they summoned the photographer. Yes, the photographer. For in that era, when a loved one departed, it was not uncommon to commission one final portrait, a memento mori, a keepsake of the face that would soon be hidden beneath the earth. These photographs were not morbid curiosities, though they may seem so to our modern eyes. They were acts of love, gestures of remembrance, tangible proof that a life, however brief, had been lived and witnessed. But among the thousands of such images that survive in archives and attic trunks, one photograph stands apart. It shows two sisters, seated side by side in a modest parlor. The elder, perhaps 13 or 14 years old, gazes directly at the camera, with an expression that is difficult to name. Not quite sorrow, not quite fear, but something suspended between the two. Her younger sister, no more than 8, leans against her shoulder, head tilted as if in sleep or comfort. The younger girl's hands rest gently in her lap. Her face, pale as porcelain, carries an unsettling serenity. At first glance it seems a portrait of love and farewell, a tender image of sisterly devotion preserved in silver and glass. But beneath the varnish of sentiment lies a truth far stranger and far darker than any posed photograph should suggest. To understand what keep. Then there was Clara, born 6 years later in the spring of 1868. Where Lydia was dutiful and composed, Clara was brightness itself, a child who laughed easily and asked questions that sometimes made her mother pause mid-stir at the cooking pot. She loved stories, particularly those about distant places and impossible things. She would sit by the fire on winter evenings and listen to her father read from the Bible or from the few books the family owned, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she were memorizing every word. The two sisters shared a small bedroom under the eaves, where frost would gather on the inside of the window in December, and the wind would whistle through gaps in the timber. They whispered to each other in the darkness before sleep claimed them, inventing games and making promises about the future. Lydia would tell Clara about the dresses they would sew when they were grown, about the cities they might visit if fortune smiled upon them. Clara, in turn, would describe the flowers she wanted to plant in a garden of her own someday, roses and violets and morning glories that would climb the porch rails. Their mother, Sarah, watched over them with the anxious tenderness common to women who had already lost one child in infancy. Their father, Thomas, worked long hours at the mill and came home smelling of sawdust and sweat, too tired for conversation, but never too tired to kiss his daughters good night. It was a life measured in seasons and chores, in hymns sung slightly off-key, and letters written to distant relatives who rarely replied. It was ordinary, and for that reason it felt safe. But even then, there were signs, small disruptions in the rhythm of their days that might have warned of what was to come. Clara had always been delicate, prone to catching colds that lingered longer than they should. In the winter of 1874, she developed a cough that would not leave her, a dry, rattling sound that echoed through the house at night. The doctor, when he finally came, diagnosed it as seasonal ague, nothing to worry over excessively. He prescribed rest, warm broths, and family kept vigil. Sarah bathed her daughter's forehead with cool cloths, whispering prayers and promises that God would be merciful. Thomas paced the parlor, helpless in the way that men of his generation often were when faced with the mysteries of illness and mortality. Lydia sat beside her sister's bed, holding Clara's hand and reading aloud from the Bible, though she suspected Clara could no longer hear her. The remedies of the time were applied with desperate hope. Poultices of mustard seed and linseed oil were pressed against Clara's chest to draw out the congestion. A few drops of laudanum, that ubiquitous opiate tincture, were administered to ease her restlessness and pain. When the fever spiked dangerously high, Sarah wrapped Clara in blankets soaked in cold water, an old folk remedy passed down from her own mother. The doctor came twice more, each time looking graver than the last. On the third visit, he took Thomas aside and spoke in low tones that Lydia could not quite hear, but understood nonetheless. There was nothing more to be done. It was in God's hands now. On the evening of February 27, 1875, Clara Moss ceased to breathe. Or so it appeared. The room fell into a stillness that seemed to swallow all sound. Sarah collapsed into her husband's arms, her sobs muffled against his shoulder. Lydia remained seated, staring at her sister's face, which looked not peaceful exactly, but distant, as if Clara had simply decided to step away for a moment and would return shortly. The doctor pressed his fingers to Clara's wrist, then to her neck, searching for a pulse. He held a small mirror to her lips, watching for the faintest fog of breath. Nothing. He pronounced her dead at 7 o'clock in the evening, and the family accepted his judgment because they had no reason not to. Death was a frequent visitor, and they knew its face well. But the silence that settled over the Moss household that night was not the silence of finality. For Lydia, it was only the beginning of something she could not name, a feeling that gnawed at the edges of her mind. Slow the inevitable decay, and of roses, a few winter blooms, purchased at considerable expense from a traveling merchant. It was into this scene that the photographer arrived, a man named Ephraim Cole, who traveled the rural circuit offering his services for weddings, family portraits, and, when necessary, post-mortem sittings. He was a quiet man, efficient and respectful, who understood that his presence was both a comfort and an intrusion. He set up his equipment with minimal fuss, adjusting the heavy tripod and positioning the large-format camera to capture the best angle. He instructed the family on how to arrange themselves, though in truth there was little instruction needed. Sarah and Thomas would not be in the photograph. They could not bear it. It would be only the sisters, together as they had always been. Clara was positioned in a chair, her body propped with hidden supports to keep her upright. Lydia was told to sit beside her, to hold her sister's hand, to look as natural as possible, as though they were simply resting together on an ordinary afternoon. But there was nothing ordinary about it. Lydia could feel the coldness of Clara's hand in hers, a coldness that seemed to seep into her own bones. She was instructed to look at the camera, to remain perfectly still for the long exposure time required. She obeyed, though her heart was pounding so hard she feared the camera might somehow capture that as well. Ephraim Cole disappeared beneath the black cloth of his camera, and the world narrowed to a single point of focus. The shutter opened, and time itself seemed to pause. Seconds stretched into minutes. Lydia did not blink. She did not breathe. And then, something happened that Ephraim Cole would later describe as a trick of the light, though he never sounded entirely convinced by his own explanation. Through the ground glass of his camera, he thought he saw Clara's lips part slightly, as if she were about to speak. He thought he saw a faint flicker beneath her closed eyelids, a movement so subtle it might have been nothing more than a shadow cast by the candlelight. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the shutter, and then who in 1972 began cataloging the Society's collection of 19th-century photography. She was drawn to the Moss portrait almost immediately, though she could not say exactly why. Perhaps it was the intensity of Lydia's gaze, which seemed to look not at the camera, but through it, as if she were trying to communicate something across the gulf of years. Or perhaps it was something about Clara, whose face, though clearly lifeless, retained an unsettling softness, a quality that made her seem not quite dead, but rather suspended in some liminal state between presence and absence. Dr. Whitmore began to investigate. She cross-referenced the names on the back of the photograph with birth and death records, with newspaper archives, with the scattered remnants of the Moss family's correspondence. What she found was fragmentary but troubling. Tucked into a folder of miscellaneous documents, she discovered a handwritten note, undated but written in the careful script of someone with medical training. The note read, "Moss Girl, February 75. Susp. Cataleptic fit. Family declined examination. Buried 3rd day." The implications were staggering. Catalepsy, a condition known to Victorian physicians but poorly understood, was a state of muscular rigidity and apparent lifelessness that could mimic death so convincingly that even trained doctors could be deceived. The note suggested that someone, perhaps the attending physician or a colleague, had harbored doubts about Clara's death, but had not pressed the matter. Why? Perhaps out of respect for the family's grief, perhaps out of fear of appearing foolish, or perhaps because, in 1875, the line between life and death was far less certain than we might imagine. Dr. Whitmore interviewed descendants of the Moss family, distant cousins and great-grandchildren, who had grown up hearing whispered stories about the photograph that cursed the house. One elderly woman recalled her grandmother speaking of Lydia, who had never married and had died young, at 32, having spent much of her adult life in a state of profound melancholy. Another relative mentioned that the original months after burial to reveal scratch marks on the inside of the lid, bodies found in contorted positions that suggested a desperate struggle for escape. These were not mere sensational stories invented to sell newspapers, though they certainly did that. They were documented cases that prompted genuine reform efforts. The invention of the safety coffin, equipped with bells or flags that could be activated from inside the grave, became a booming industry. Patents were filed for elaborate contraptions involving air tubes and signaling devices, mechanical solutions to a problem that was fundamentally biological. The difficulty of determining with absolute certainty that a person was truly dead. The medical knowledge of 1875 was limited in ways that are difficult for us to comprehend. There were no reliable methods for measuring brain activity, no advanced understanding of coma states or neurological conditions. Doctors relied on a combination of observations: the absence of breath, the lack of a detectable pulse, the onset of rigor mortis. But these signs could be deceptive. Certain conditions, catalepsy among them, could produce a state of profound unresponsiveness that mimicked death almost perfectly. The heartbeat could slow to the point of being undetectable by the crude methods available at the time. Breathing could become so shallow that even a mirror held to the lips would not fog. The body could stiffen, not from rigor mortis, but from muscular rigidity associated with a cataleptic state. Tuberculosis, which may have been the underlying cause of Clara's illness, was another complicating factor. The disease could produce episodes of extreme weakness and unconsciousness that family members might interpret as the final stages of dying. In rural areas, where access to medical expertise was limited, and doctors were often overworked and undertrained, misdiagnoses were tragically common. And so, we arrive at a chilling realization, one that does not lessen the horror of the Moss case, but rather deepens it. The rational explanation, grounded in medical history and documented precedent, is that Clara Moss may have been alive when her wrote, "I still feel her hand cold in mine, yet I cannot release it. In my dreams she speaks to me, but I cannot hear the words. I wake with the taste of earth in my mouth." Later entries reveal a deepening sense of guilt and unease. In October of that same year, Mother says I must stop grieving, that it is unhealthy to dwell so upon the dead. But how can I explain to her that I am not grieving? I am listening. I am waiting for something I cannot name. And in December, I returned to the cemetery today, though Father forbade it. The ground is frozen, and the stone is cold beneath my hand. I pressed my ear to the earth, and I swear I heard something, a whisper, or perhaps only the wind. I no longer know the difference. The photograph, which had been displayed on the parlor mantelpiece, was eventually removed and hidden away, though Lydia kept a copy in her room. She would stare at it for hours, searching her own captured face for some sign of what she had known, or should have known, in that terrible moment when the shutter opened. The bond between the sisters, which had been so strong in life, seemed to have become a chain in death, binding Lydia to a past she could neither escape nor fully understand. She became reclusive, avoiding social gatherings and declining offers of courtship from young men in the town. Her parents worried, but they attributed her melancholy to grief, a natural response to the loss of a beloved sister. They could not know, or perhaps could not allow themselves to know, that Lydia's suffering was more complex than simple sorrow. She was haunted not by what she had lost, but by what she might have unknowingly allowed to happen. There is a particular cruelty and uncertainty in the knowledge that we can never truly know the answer to a question that matters more than any other. Did Clara die peacefully in her bed, her suffering ended by the mercy of fever, or did she wake in darkness, trapped in a box of wood and silk, her faint cries swallowed by 6 feet of frozen earth? Lydia lived with this question for the rest of her brief life, and it consumed her. A candle burned low beside the photograph, its wax pooling like time itself dissolving, and in its flickering light, Lydia's handwriting grew more erratic, her entries more uncertain threshold, where we are most vulnerable and most unknowing. Post-mortem photography, which flourished in the Victorian era and gradually faded in the early 20th century, was part of a broader cultural response to the omnipresence of death. These images served multiple purposes. They were keepsakes for the bereaved, tangible objects that could be held and looked at in moments of longing. They were also assertions of dignity, attempts to present the dead as peaceful and composed, rather than ravaged by illness or disfigured by trauma. But they were something else as well, something we might not fully appreciate until we examine them closely. They were acts of witnessing, proof that a life, however brief, had existed and mattered. In an era before universal birth certificates and comprehensive record-keeping, a photograph might be the only evidence that a child named Clara Moss had lived on this earth. The fear of premature burial, meanwhile, led to significant public health reforms. By the early 20th century, medical schools had begun to develop more rigorous protocols for determining death, including the use of stethoscopes to detect faint heartbeats, and the observation of longer waiting periods before burial. Embalming practices, which became widespread in America following the Civil War, also served as a safeguard, as the process itself would reveal any signs of remaining life. Safety coffins, though they capture the imagination, were rarely used in practice, perhaps because the terror they represented was too great to confront directly. Modern medical experts, when presented with cases like that of Clara Moss, can offer explanations grounded in neurology and pathology. Catalepsy, they note, can be associated with epilepsy, severe psychiatric disorders, or neurological damage from infectious diseases. The condition is rare but well documented, and historical accounts of premature burial often align with what we now understand about such states. Yet this knowledge, precise and scientific as it is, does not entirely dispel the horror. If anything, it makes it more real, more concrete. It becomes not just a historical artifact, but a philosophical object, a reminder that photographs, like memories, are both truthful and deceptive, revealing and concealing in equal measure. Perhaps the camera does not lie, but neither does it tell the whole truth. The image shows us only surfaces, only the interplay of light and shadow on a particular day at a particular moment. It cannot tell us what Lydia was thinking as she sat beside her sister, her hand cold in Clara's cold hand. It cannot tell us whether Clara's lips truly parted, whether some faint spark of consciousness lingered behind those closed eyelids. It cannot tell us whether Lydia's suspicions were justified, or whether they were merely the product of grief and guilt and the human need to find meaning in tragedy. What it does tell us, what all such photographs tell us, is that we are mortal, that the people we love will leave us, and that the manner of their leaving is often beyond our control or understanding. The Moss sisters remained together, one alive, one still, both forever suspended between light and shadow, between memory and mystery. In the end, we are left with questions rather than answers, which is perhaps as it should be. History is not a neat narrative with clear resolutions. It is a collection of fragments, of partial truths and unverifiable claims, of documents that survive by chance and voices that fall silent without warning. The story of Lydia and Clara Moss is one such fragment, preserved in silver and paper, in fading ink and second-hand testimony. We cannot know for certain what happened in that Kentucky parlor in 1875. We cannot exhume Clara's body, cannot examine her remains, cannot run the diagnostic tests that might confirm or refute the suspicion of premature burial. We can only look at the photograph, at the faces of two sisters who were separated by death or something that resembled it, and acknowledge the terrible possibility that our ancestors, with all their rituals and remedies, were sometimes wrong in ways that haunt us still. Clara, whether she died peacefully or woke in terror, is beyond our reach now, beyond questioning or comfort. But they exist still, in that frozen moment, in that careful arrangement of light and shadow, and they ask us, across the span of more than a century, to remember them, to wonder about them, and to acknowledge the fragile thread that separates life from death, knowing from not knowing, love from loss. This is their legacy, and it is ours as well.